couple of things along the way. And I think first of all, I will thank you all for the opportunity to come and be part of the CAWASA series. And the intention for my presentation, the discussion, is to share a little bit of what I've learned so far during my experience, and hoping that some of it could be used and you all could, try to adapt accordingly. What I've found, different countries, we have different regulatory environments, and it's always useful to share with one another in terms of what we do. All right, so let me just switch across. Everybody's seeing my screen, right?
Yeah, correct.
Yeah, all right. So once I switch, I will not be able to. Let me just make sure. See anyone, so some maybe have to interrupt me to see. All right, so quickly, basic foundation. What is safety? I mean, anybody want to, what is our definition of safety? When we hear safety, what does that mean? Anybody want to volunteer a quick definition?
Yeah, participants, feel free to either use your microphones or you can use the chat to respond.
All right, so while we getting our participants to respond, very simple definition I use is the control or elimination of recognized workplace hazards to attain an acceptable level of risk. Quite a mouthful, but a lot of keywords inside of there, and one being hazards and risk. All right, and simply, a hazard, simple definition, is an existing or potential act or condition that by itself or interact with other variables can result in injury, death, losses, etc. All right, so it's a potential or existing act. So when we talk about unsafe acts or unsafe conditions, these are hazards. Now, the key to safety is really how do we manage hazards in order to reduce the level of risk. And again, this begs the question, what is risk? And quite simply, for most of all most of us who may be familiar with risk management, risk is very simply the measurement of the probability and the severity of an impact. So when we talk about risk, how likely is something is supposed to happen, something happen, a result of a hazard, and if it did occur, what will be the consequence or the worst case scenario, right? So for every hazard in the workplace, we are always doing what we call risk assessment, which is what is the worst thing that could happen if this hazard was to manifest itself? And if it did happen, what is the probability? Right? Now, the reason why that is important is when we look at occupational safety programs, you are always required or faced with limitations in terms of resources and so forth. So as a safety professional or management, you're talking to your managers and your management. You have to be able to assess your hazards based on the nature of your operations and do some sort of risk assessment. In that way, you are able now to discern or prioritize what are we going to deal with and in what order. Because the reality is we all have limitation in terms of resources, whether it's time, money, people, and so forth. And therefore, you have to ensure that we deal with our high-risk activities first, have proper controls in place, and then you go down into your lower risk areas. Okay? So in Trinidad, we have the Occupational Health and Safety Act, it's the primary legislation. It is actually mirrored after the legislation in the UK. So Trinidad, like most of the Caribbean islands, are in fact Commonwealth countries. So our legislation is fairly similar to what exists in England. It's the Management of Safety at Work Act 1974. And you'll find, if you look at the Canadian safety legislation, South African safety legislation, Australian safety legislation, because we are all Commonwealth countries, you'll find there are a lot of similarities, right? Of course, in Canada, Australia, and UK, they are much more developed in terms of the regulations and the details of their particular legislation. Now, Guyana also has, I think fairly recently, have passed their occupational health and safety legislation. And I believe I saw a draft of Grenada some time ago. And I know different islands may have had bills around or drafts. So when I looked at some of them, they're more or less similar. They are similar in their approach, right? So health and safety legislation, they set out a basic principle of how certain hazards or standards are to be dealt with. Not all of the details are contained in what we call the parent piece of legislation, and that is why oftentimes you have a parent legislation and then what we call regulations. And the regulations are secondary to the parent, which will contain specific details. So in Trinidad, we have the OSHA Act, but then we have a regulation on dealing with trenching and excavations. We'll have a regulation that talks about first aid. We have a regulation that will speak to electrical hazards, right? So that is how the legislation is normally shaped. This allows for the law to be easily updated. So you don't really have to go back to the Parent Act. All you need to do is refine or improve the legislation. Okay, now in Trinidad and in the Caribbean, the legislation is really a risk-based approach as opposed to United States. United States has the US OSHA Act. Their legislation is more prescriptive in nature. It's very detailed in terms of specific standards and so forth. So it's slightly different to what exists in the Caribbean. Now, that does not mean there is no value, because oftentimes, if we don't have a specific regulation or a standard to refer to, we would go back to an ANSI standard or the ASTM standard or a US OSHA standard. So for example, if I am looking for specific standards for scaffolding or working at heights or confined space entry, I will build my operational procedures using US OSHA guidelines. And that's fine because some of these guidelines are well known, they're very robust, and they are fit for purpose in terms of congruity between our legislation and acceptable standards. All right, so we call them codes of practice, for want of a better word, and they help supplement our acts and regulation, provide practical guidance, but non-compliance does not necessarily constitute an offense, because it may still be used as evidence, supplementary evidence to prosecute, but you cannot be held liable for failing to comply with a standard that is not enshrined in the legislation, right? But what the OSHA authority will use is those guidelines to establish whether you would have had a fit and purposeful safety program in place, right? Very quickly, aims of the OSHA Act: protect persons in industrial establishment, protect persons not in industrial establishment, and the Act themselves imposes minimum requirements or standards. And of course, non-compliance is an offense. Now, in the OSHA Act, and I believe I saw in some of the other legislation, you have a duty of care. Every employer has a duty of care to not only its employees, but persons who may be affected by its operations. And that is where now there's some nexus between some of the things we will normally put in place. So before we started, I was talking to Ignatius about chlorine safety. So yes, you have a chlorine safety program for your operators who are required to change chlorine cylinders and operate the chlorine system. But if there's a chlorine leak, what you could have now is chlorine gas being released outside of your fence line, outside of your property boundaries. And then what you have now is a community risk, right? So now persons and members of the public could be impacted, people could get sick, and you have that impact. So the OSHA Act, the standards in which you must put in place, requires you to put measures that not only protects your employees, but how do you respond to a chlorine emergency and protect members of the public? So in your emergency response plan, you have to consider early warning systems, maybe having a community muster point where you could evacuate the community, inform them very early that there's a chlorine release, where you should be going to, and then also putting mechanism in place to maybe measure the level of chlorines in your community and so forth, right? So that is just a simple example. Another example would be excavations. We do excavations invariably within the in public environment, public spaces, in streets. And of course, you have a duty to protect the excavation because, in the Caribbean, we are very inquisitive people. And when we see work going on, we always want to venture very close to the edge of the trench. And as we say in Trinidad, Mako, right? We like to look on, take videos, especially social media environment in which we live in, right? People always taking videos, but you have to protect the members of the public. So you may have to establish a safe access for pedestrians, making sure you protect vehicles and so forth. So that's another example of where you have to take measures to protect persons who are not in your employment. Yeah, we good so far, everybody? All right. Employer duties, very basically in legislation, we have a duty of care so far as reasonably practicable. And I'll get back to what does that mean, right? To ensure the safety, health, and welfare of employees. So employees are required to have a safe plant and system of work, safe handling and use of equipment, providing necessary information, supervision, training, and instruction of employees, safe place of work in terms of access, egress, fire safety, safe work environment, your welfare facilities, first aid, and so forth. Now, safe system of the work are what we refer to, I would term what we call control of work system. So if there's a particular type of work to be done, how do we ensure we have proper procedures in place and persons understand the procedures and there's assurance built in around conformance to the procedures? So some of us may be familiar with what we call toolbox meeting, job safety analysis, or JHA, job hazard analysis, permit to work. All these things fall within the ambit of what we call systems of work. As I indicated, we use a risk-based approach. And unfortunately, in the OSHA Act, the burden of proof is always placed on the employer to prove that they acted reasonably in the circumstances. And that means it was not practicable or reasonably practicable to do more better than what was done, in fact, done to satisfy the duty of or requirement. So unlike criminal law, where you are innocent until proven guilty, when it comes to safety law, in terms of how it's practiced in Trinidad, how people can be taken to court, you are guilty and you have to prove your innocence. And in proven innocence, you have to demonstrate that you acted reasonably practicable. Right? So there's a reverse burden of proof when it comes to safety as opposed to criminal law. Yeah. So types of statutory duties. If you read the legislation, there are absolute duties. So the employer must or shall. The employer has no has no choice. So when you see the word must or shall in any phrase, you mean that's an absolute duty. So far as practicable, employer must consider current technological knowledge and feasibility. And then we have this term again, so far as reasonably practicable. And what that means now, the employer can balance the cost of action versus the risk being considered. Right? Now, again, come back to risk. So in every type of work you're doing, you have to look at the risk, assess the risk, and then take actions or put measures in place that are so far as reasonably practicable. So if you, for one of a very bad example, if you know the risk of a particular exercise could result in the death of a person, then whatever measures you put in place, you have to reduce, it has to be more robust as compared to something where the worst thing can happen is somebody suffer a cut to their finger, right? It's still an injury, it's still an injury, but the risk is much lower. Okay. So the absolute duty, highest level of duty, and as I indicated, is when you see the word shall. So you'll have one example in legislation is every employer shall prepare or revise a written statement. So that refers to a policy statement, right? So every employer in Trinidad and Tobago shall have a written safety policy, right? So that's absolute. Reasonably practicable, you have to balance the cost, the time, and the effort against the risk, and it must be a balancing act. Now, there are also responsibilities of employees. So every time I do this presentation, employers tend to, they tend to think the act requires so much of them, but also the act is supposed to be balanced. The employer does have the brunt of the responsibility, but also employees. In our legislation, general duties of employees. So employees on the act, and this is what they are legislatively required to do. Take reasonable care for safety and health of themselves and others who may be affected. Cooperate with the employer in terms of compliance with employer's duties. Report to employer breaches of the act. Use PPE properly. Take care of it. Not to interfere or misuse health and safety and welfare items. So if you put fire extinguishers or your SBAs or your fire alarms, do not interfere or damage it. You can be charged under the OSHA Act. Not to undertake any willful acts causing death or critical injury. Again, employees could be held liable if their actions resulted in the death or injury of our employee or member of the public. Not to be under the influence of any intoxicant, drugs, those sort of things. And in Trinidad, what we call refuse to work. So an employee may refuse to work if he believes a particular task or environment is unsafe. But within the act, there's a very specific procedure you must follow. So it's not meant to be an arbitrary form of action an employee could take. The employee has to demonstrate that this particular item, this particular task, this particular piece of equipment is unsafe and could result in injury or death. Okay. All right. So types of hazards in general for workplaces, especially water and wastewater utilities. Housekeeping, slip, trip, falls. Actually, in Trinidad, we actually have 30% of our accidents are surprisingly slip, trip, falls. Right? Ergonomic issues. Whether you're sitting at your desk and you're on the computer, people suffer carpal tunnel syndrome, eyes impacted by looking at the computer screens, or manual handling. We do a lot of lifting. The water utility business is a lot of lifting. The guys working out in the fields, we're doing pipe laying, we are digging ditches and so forth. Yes, we have mechanical equipment, but there's a lot of manual labor in this workplace, right? Electrical hazards, high voltage equipment, pumps and motors. Biohazards in the wastewater environment, persons are always at risk of exposure to bacteria and viruses and so forth. Mechanical hazards, crush injury, being struck by something moving. Chemicals, use a lot of chemicals in the water treatment process. Alum, lime, activated carbon, sequestering agents, polymers. Physical hazards refer to vibration, noise. That's what we refer to as physical hazards. And a nice term, psychosocial. And psychosocial refers essentially to mental fatigue, workplace violence, sexual harassment, those sort of things. Housekeeping, tripping hazards, power cords, hoses across walkways. We may have open-sided floors and platforms, clutter in the walkways. Openings, we have manholes that remain open, so persons could fall from height. Right? Open pits, vats, ditches, and of course wet floors, wet surface, especially on our water treatment plants. When you go to look at the pumps, around the pump platform, if you have leaking glands, it's always wet. And where it's wet in our environment, you get moss, and that makes it very slippery. Ergonomics. As I indicated, visual discomfort, repetitive strain, muscular injuries, and that is where heavy equipment or practicing improper lifting techniques. Now we all know manual handling, basic manual handling. Bend, lift with your knees, not with your back. Try to avoid a lot of lifting. Don't overextend. And as much as we don't like it in the Caribbean, because we are very macho, it's okay to ask someone to help you or to use a mechanical aid, pallet jack, those sort of things. There are lifting equations. NIOSH out of the States has a lifting equation you could use. There's also a lot of nice software free from HSE UK, depending on what you want to do. So you could actually do some calculations in terms of what is the tolerable level of weight to be lifted based on the type of lift you are doing, right? So there are programs out there that can help you. Electrical, overloaded circuits, extension cords, damaged electrical wires, unsecure electrical panels, entering electrical panels without authorization. Entering any electrical panel is what we normally require is a lockout tagout system and a work permit system. Biological hazards, wastewater. Many of our facilities, many of our raw water, we have farm discharges, industrial discharges. So the raw water from the river is not always bacteriologically safe, depending on which part of the river you're abstracting water from. Trinidad do have venomous creatures, spiders and bees and so forth. And we do have 4 species of snakes that are extremely venomous. We have vipers and we have coral snakes, and coral snakes are families or cousins of the cobras. So the type of venom, the vipers has a hemolytic toxin. So when you are bitten by, if you're unfortunately bitten by a viper, it causes necrosis, hemorrhaging of the tissue. If you're bitten by a coral snake, that venom affects the central nervous system and shuts down breathing. So any one of them, it's quite a painful death, but we do have medical facilities that have the anti-venom if you can get the persons very quickly for medical care. I believe St. Lucia is one of the few islands I believe do have vipers. I think the St. Lucian viper, which I believe is supposed to be a family of the Trinidadian viper. In Trinidad, we call them Ferdinands. I think in some other islands, South America, they call them, they're called lancehead. But they're all what we call from the genus Botrops. Mechanical. Moving parts, we talk about entanglement, crushing, impact, abrasions, bruising, tools with sharp edges, cuts, laceration, punctures, stabbing, being struck by heavy equipment, so forth. Chemicals, we spoke about chemicals. Physical hazards, noise, dust, extreme heat. We're in the dry season in Caribbean, it's very hot. Radiation from welding affects your eyes. Vibration, working from heights, confined spaces, all considered to be physical environments. We did have an incident many years ago of a guy puncturing, I wouldn't say puncturing his foot, but he suffered a fracture in his metatarsals from jackhammering. So jackhammering it's very noisy to use a jackhammer, and a jackhammer is actually kind of heavy. So you have the vibration being transmitted to the person's body as well as noise. But the person wasn't properly, adequately trained, and unfortunately lost control of the jackhammer, and the blade, or the blade, for want of a better word, the tool came in contact with the top of his foot, his instep, and he suffered a fracture. So since then, what we have done, we have changed the PP requirements for persons involved in jackhammering. So we use welder's boots. So there's a steel metal tassel, a steel plate to cover the metal tassels. So in addition to being steel tip shoes, we require now that you wear boots with a metatarsal guard. Again, the risk might be small, but when we look at the cost of ordering these boots, you weigh it up, right? It's not so much of an increase in the cost, but when you look at how much you are able to reduce the risk, it made sense for us. Of course, coupled with retraining of the workforce and those sort of things. Psychosocial. Mental health, I think, is probably one of the biggest issues now facing, especially out of COVID. And we have to be mindful that our workers are human beings, and human beings, all of us have different capacity for work and for working and understanding, and we have to be mindful of that. And there's a lot of information about what we call human factors in safety, where we look at the cognitive ability and the skills required and how best do they match the individual, right? So it's a lot of work in terms of decision-making in persons and how they learn and how they process information, right? Workplace bullying, another big thing we must be conscious of. Sexual harassment, especially we have female workers. Fatigue for shift workers. A lot of shift workers, sometimes shift workers are asked to work beyond their normal 8-hour work period, and they may work 2 shifts, 16 hours continuously. And then if you don't have sufficient recovery time, then cumulatively we can have fatigue, and fatigue can lead to errors in judgment and then something happening, right? So fatigue is something you always need to manage in terms of fatigue management. Lone worker. Some places we have workers working alone. We have to be mindful of that in terms of security. Trinidad, we do have our challenges in terms of national security and crime, so that's something also we need to work. We have to put in place and be conscious of in terms of lone workers and safety. Hazard identification. Number of tools could be used to identify hazards. Safety inspections. When you go around to your workplace, conduct an inspection of your work site, and generally you could see examples of unsafe acts or unsafe conditions, and that is important. Oftentimes, even when I'm talking to my safety officers, I tell them that you not only look at the physical environment for non-conformances, but also observe the behaviors or the actions that employees are performing, right? Because oftentimes when we do accident investigation, most accidents require 2 things to happen: an unsafe act and an unsafe condition. Most, right? So, you know, when I do investigations, I'm always looking to see what was the unsafe act that took place and what was the unsafe condition. An unsafe act doesn't necessarily mean that the person was deliberate. We're saying that people make mistakes or they do something that they believe to be safe, right? Either from misinterpretation or something like that. Accidents, incident reports could also be used if you have a very strong accident reporting system in place. Material safety data sheets for your chemicals will also give you, is also a good repository of information in terms of hazards. Risk assessment, JSAs, if you do a job safety analysis of a task. Facilities in checklists, so the PPOs, if you have PPOs doing, before they pick up shift, they do a quick check of the workplace, the equipment, the SCBAs, and so forth. That also gives an idea. And of course, workers' suggestions are also a rich opportunity to get some feedback from the workforce in general of what their perceptions of the workplace is. In terms of accidents, it's always good to trend your accidents and match your accidents against lost work days. This way, you can help identify what type of accidents is resulting in what we call most injury days or days away from work. So that also helps you identify more severe accidents or accident types. Another example of what we try to do, we look at different accident types and match it against the type of work is taking place. So what this does is it demonstrates to us which accidents are more frequently occurring in the workplace and in what type of work environment is it taking place. Right? So, I mean, in this one, persons who are involved in pipeline repair, pipeline maintenance, laying pipelines, you get a lot of struck by and caught between accidents taking place. As opposed to in the workplace, in the offices, you have more slip trip falls. So what does that allows us to do is help fine tune your safety program depending on the type of workers you are required to interact with. So you know what you could have, therefore, is a safety program that is geared around your PPUs, a safety program around your pipeline crews, a safety program around your office workers, because each of them, based on the nature of the work they're doing, as well as the work environment, there are different types of hazards, and therefore you have to tailor your safety program, your safety interventions accordingly. PPOs, your process plant safety inspection checklist. PPOs are in charge of the facilities, they're in charge of the plans, and they are supposed to be or should be doing basic safety and pre-inspections of the facility and equipment. And of course, you could have in terms of looking at the SCBA, the chlorine, fire safety, hazardous chemicals, and so forth. And you could get a lot of information. So they are actually verifying that the facility and equipment are fit for use. SCBA checklist. Normally we ask all our operators when they take up shift to check the SCBA kits. All right, so when you take it over, check to ensure the mask is in good condition, the cylinder is pressurized, and so forth, and sign off on it so that we know that we have the necessary safety equipment is available. God forbid you do not want a chlorine release to happen, and then you realize that you don't have sufficient air in your cylinder. Yeah. Hierarchy of controls. Basic, elimination, substitution, engineering controls, admin controls, PPE. And when we talk about engineering controls, we try to eliminate or avoid a particular hazard. You may isolate if it's noise, or substitute if it's a chemical, substitute for something less hazardous. Administrative controls. So you may have job rotation, training, not training, your safety procedures, medical surveillance, and of course PPE. And in terms of hierarchy, you're always looking for engineering controls. So you always try to eliminate or avoid the hazard as best as you can. Right? Yep. So some photos. This one is not Trinidad, but you get an idea of person walking at height, and there are people walking, and something could fall onto persons below. Right? Walking from height with all rails or fall protection. And then persons walking below. This one, chemical storage, not the most pleasant. Activated carbon, not properly stacked, bags are burst, it's causing a lot of dust and has the workplace looking not the best condition. And this one is a scaffolding. As you can see, the bottom of the scaffolding is a H-frame scaffolding. It's not properly secured. They have made it up with brick, and in this one, they have placed it on a ledge. So it's a lot of non-conformances, non-compliance that was immediately flagged. There's only one working plank at the top. With scaffolding, the working surface must be fully planked. Grinder, no guards. So you have an unsecured gas cylinder as well. So you have grinding taking place to a flammable source. And this one is an office environment. As you can see, it's we have an extension cord run from the roof. I don't know why, but I can't remember what happened with this one. This is a wastewater treatment plant. No, water treatment plants. It's a cone clarifier. And you can see the broken handrails over a large body of water. So you have the access gangway, but the guardrails are in very, very bad condition. Well, chlorine cylinders, unsecured. Defective brace is broken, so it's not really secured. Tripping hazard here. So how do we try to put something in place for safety? Very simple safety philosophy I like to use is a PPE approach. Now, we talk about PPE. When we talk about PPE, we always think of gloves and helmets and reflective vests, personal protective equipment. But when I refer to PPE approach for safety, I use this one: safe person, safe process, safe equipment. Right? And if you look at any hazard or any type of work you're doing, and you ensure within these three elements, you have controls in place, that is very effective in ensuring you have a good safety management of that particular type of activity. So when we talk about safe persons, it's about the knowledge, attitudes, and actions. Are our persons well trained? Do they understand what is required? Do they have the required competencies? Do they have the right attitude? Are we giving them proper supervision? When we talk about process, do we have SOPs for that particular process, for the work, sorry? Is there a risk assessment? Do we do GSAs? And if you have special permits in place, are we using permits as required? And safe equipment, in terms of shoring your SCBAs, your tools, housekeeping, fall protection, fire protection, those sort of things. So these three elements, if factored in and well managed, you're really on the right path to having a fairly good safety program in place. Safety indicators are always useful. Invariably, you always want to know, how am I performing in relation to another utility or to the sector? And generally, but we use very simple accident frequency rate or employee injury severity rate. Right? And these are calculated per million man hours or per 100 workers. Right? So we trend data and we try to see how are we doing on a monthly basis against a agreed target set by the board. So this is one such graph we tracking total accidents and lost time accidents over a period of time. Now, what we have been trying to do, what we're looking to implement now is what we call life-saving rules. Based on our accidents analysis, based on the type of activities we have in Trinidad and I guess in the Caribbean also, we have identified 10 specific type of hazards or controls that are required in order to reduce or mitigate fatalities or critical injuries, right? So we came up with these 10 life-saving rules. You call them 10 commandments if you wish. And these life-saving rules are a checklist to be followed or to be assured or verified before we do any sort of work. So the rules have a rule statement and specific actions. And what our rules are. Now, the work could only commence until individuals involved are aware of and can confirm that the life-saving rules and the controls are in place. So it requires persons to stop, assess the job, and then before the job starts, verify that the controls are in place. So our life-saving rules for utilities: excavation and trenching, work permit system, use of PPE, lockout, tagout, confined space, working at height, chemical handling, electrical works, hand and power tools, and lifting and hoisting. Right? Because we believe these, when we look at all accidents, we believe that these are the 10 things, depending on the nature of the incident, that if we have a very strong control over, we will avoid fatalities and major incidents. So, excavation and trenching, ensuring that all utilities are identified before you start any digging. Persons are trained in excavation and trenching. Making sure spoils are adequately placed away from the edge of the trench. Excavations more than 5 feet are properly protected. Any depths more than 4 feet, you have a ladder. And a qualified engineer must sign off on any excavation to ensure it's safe for persons to enter. Qualified engineer, what we call, or what we term a competent person. So right now, what we're trying to do is conduct competent persons training for supervisors involved in excavation and trenching operations. Hot work permits, we have 3 different types of permits. General work permit, hot work permits, confined space, and persons being on those types of work are required to get a work permit approved in order to start those works. PPE, ensuring that persons use their PPE properly and they take care of the PPE. And if it's damaged or defective, report it immediately for it to be changed and replaced as the case might be. Also with PPE is training workers to understand what type of PPE is required based on the hazards of the job. Lockout, tagout, especially for energized or pressurized pieces of equipment, pipelines, confirm that the controls are locked out and tagged out, and the system is de-energized or depressurized, as the case might be. Now, lockout tagout normally works in conjunction with your work permit system, right? So you'll find oftentimes, depending on the type of work you are doing, if it's a piece of equipment, you use your lockout tagout in addition to your permit. So a condition of the permit will be to ensure that your lockout tagout is put in place. Confined space, our environment, we have to enter confined spaces, whether it's manholes, pressure filters, clarifiers, vessels. We have to go into these areas. And confined space, we all are aware that confined spaces presents their own risk in terms of entanglement, persons are exposed to oxygen deficient environment or exposed to dangerous gases, hydrogen sulfide, buildup of carbon monoxide, those sort of things, right? So we have to always have to be careful depending on the type of space we are entering. A confined space that is done under a work permit system, there's a rescue plan in place, there's air quality testing before you go into any confined space. Right, so the life-saving rules will spell out the basic requirements of confined space work. Work at height, ensuring that your scaffolding are properly erected and certified by a competent person. Persons are wearing their fall protection. Persons are trained to work at heights. Okay? And protecting the immediate area below so that pedestrians or anyone passing are not at risk of something falling off the scaffold onto them. Chemical handling, a big one in the utility business. Chlorine, it's probably the biggest one. We also do a lot of chemicals, whether it's powdered or liquid, and ensuring that our employees have the right PPE. There's a right to know any chemical in the workplace. Employees have a right to know how to use the chemical, what is the PPE, what are the health effects, how to recognize exposure of or health effects as a result of exposure to a chemical, and so forth. Also putting in place spill kits, emergency showers, eye wash stations, those sort of things. Electrical works, similarly with our works together with your lockout tagout. We do have ensuring that only persons who are certified to work on electrical equipment are allowed to interface with the pieces of equipment. All right, so we have a lot of high voltage equipment, 460 volts. Sometimes we have 66 kVA, 33 kVA power coming in. So we have persons who are high voltage specialists, and then those persons who could do the normal 220, 440 supply. So once we're talking high voltage, there's a particular tier of personnel who have been pre-screened or authorized to interfere with that voltage of a certain height, of a certain level. Hand and power tools. You will be amazed at how many people get injured, suffer hand injuries from using these tools, whether it's grinders, hammers, pneumatic drills, all these different things. Right? We have had injuries where people losing control of cut saws. So they're using these rotating disc cut saws to cut pipe, and there's kickback, person suffers injury. Again, because of proper handling. Lifting and hoisting, whether it's forklifts, high-abs, cranes, articulated cranes, we make sure that all our persons who are required to use this piece of equipment are certified and trained. The lifting devices themselves are inspected by a competent or third party to certify that the lifting device is fully functional. And where required, we will ensure there's a lift plan. So high-risk lift plan. So once you're approaching 80% of the maximum lifting capacity, we do lift plans. Or where you're lifting over process equipment, you have to do a lift plan. Okay. All right. So I guess, yeah, 5 o'clock on the dot, actually. So, yeah, any questions? I know I kind of run through.
Yeah, thank you, Karim.
Yeah.
That project, that was very comprehensive. I guess you had to keep within the time, but that's all fair. Colleagues, do you have any questions or comments you wish to have? I think, yes, we have one.
Sorry, Ignatius, if I can just interject, I'm afraid I have to leave right now for another meeting. And maybe Roger could just talk a little bit about the Occupational Health and Safety and Disaster Committee very briefly too. So see you next week. Bye-bye.
Yeah. Okay, bye. Take it easy.
Bye. Thank you, Bob. Yeah, there's a question in the chat. I don't know if you can see it. Otherwise, I can read it out.
Yeah, it's something with psychosocial segment. What he has a lone worker, what are the requirements to safeguard lone worker safety on a treatment RO plan according to OSHA regulations. All right, so there are no OSHA regulations per se. And like I said, you have to do perform what we call a risk assessment, and you have to look and say, okay, what are the likely hazards person going to? Is it a security, a crime issue? Is it a medical issue? So, for example, if you have a lone worker, I would probably want to have a little more controls in place. So if you know somebody who is prone to, for one of a let's say epileptical fits, I probably wouldn't want that person working by themselves, right? Similarly, if workers are required to go into areas in which we deem to be a little more at risk of criminal elements, you want to make sure there's security or there's another person to accompany them, or you change your operations so that you don't have to go there in the dead of the night, so to speak. So you do most of your valving operations. You schedule in such a way, right? So that is how you look at it. Or you also require there is communication, ample communication of or calling by the employee. Right, so is it every hour somebody calls in, verifies? You may need to put in cameras, remote cameras, so you can monitor the station remotely. Or you may also have access to a rapid response security firm. So it all depends on what scenario you're dealing with. Yeah, I hope I answered the question.
Just on the side, you did mention about the snakes in the poisonous snakes. Yes, in St. Lucia, it's called by a similar name, the fer de lance.
Right.
In St. Lucia. So yeah, it's a poisonous snake. One of the things you mentioned was, well, I was going to ask, yeah, during your inspections on the work sites or the plants, are there any consequences or penalties for non-compliance with the standards established in the workplace?
Yeah. Okay, great question. And that has always been a little issue. So the safety officers are normally empowered. We can issue a non-compliance ticket. It's something like I don't want to see. I often don't like to refer to safety officers as policemen. The responsibility for safety in any workplace lies with the supervisor and employees rather than the safety officer, right? But we do have an enforcement role. So you can issue a non-conformance or non-compliance, or if something is immediately dangerous, you can issue what we call a work stoppage. Now, what we've been trying to do is use the non-conformances, or I should say, as a KPI for your supervisors and managers. So you have a number, you have to now report and say how many of your non-conformances you have been able to reduce or to correct within a specific time. And that feeds back into your performance because, as you rightfully said, without a consequence, there really and truly is no incentive or impetus to correct. Yeah, and that is always one of the things. And that is where you need some dialogue in terms of with your unions, your to understand that, okay, fine. And in your performance management system, if you build safety requirements into your performance management system, you get a lot more traction going forward. Yeah.
Yeah, excellent.
Yeah. Seeing somebody, Sherry, I believe. Yeah.
I didn't see. I'm just checking the chat now. I don't see a new comment. Is there? Oh,
I think
yes.
I saw.
Oh, that's just a link to join the CWWA Health and Safety Disaster Management Specialist Group.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I
These are the
saw
forms that just posted.
Ignition, I saw
Thank you,
Sherry
Maureen.
Bell Parker shut her hand up briefly.
Oh, I didn't see that. Please
Yeah.
proceed, Terry. I'm not seeing it. what the win, please proceed because I'm not seeing Cherubel Parker.
Oh, okay. Yeah, afternoon, everyone.
Yeah.
Good, thorough, good presentation. Oh, a couple of times, and again, across the board, it may not be exclusive to wastewater or any particular sector. A lot of times, employers, and again, it's in the OSHA Act where, and again, I could be corrected, where the employer is responsible for PPE, for the employee's PPE. And even though it may not, it may be an issue in some and it may not be an issue in others, across the board conversations are being had that, and again, that could be corrected where, employers should be responsible for the provision of PPE. Which leads me to the other question of although there is, what employers are responsible for making sure that the hazards are being aware of to the employees. Again, should there also be a double duty of, again, training the employees as far as knowing, because, again, you may have the notion where that the supervisor is there and they have this particular load, and you might have the notion that, the employees or the supervisors are totally responsible. Then, the employees, you might have a question and then the employees may not know. So it's also vitally important sometimes for the employers to really, do retraining in certain aspects, because most times the employees are doing the work. That's one, to prevent accidents and incidents. Also, what provisions you have if an employee says, you know what, I'm not doing that, and the risk of, and again, comes into the question of Mr. Jha, what are the risks of, or I should say, what are the catchness to ensure that the employee isn't victimized for saying that, hey, I'm not doing it just because I feel it's unsafe, just based off the information that I know. What are the ramifications of that in that particular environment?
So so your question was refusal. I guess you're talking about refusal to work, right? Well, in Trinidad, the refusal to work, there's a very clear procedure that must be followed. Refusal to work, every employer has a refusal to work, and that refusal to work is protected in the law. So once the refusal to work is being done responsibly, and the employee will not be victimized, you cannot cut the person's salary, and so forth. So that the employee is protected under the Act. But there is also a responsibility of the employee in that an employee cannot say, I'm not working because it's unsafe. And then when you ask the employee, he says, well, the place is unsafe. The Act requires the employee to state specifically what it is that is unsafe. Because if you say the place is unsafe, that could be anything, right? You have to say exactly, because you have to give the employer an opportunity to correct the non-conformance or the unsafe act or unsafe condition equipment that exists, right? Also, the employee is supposed to stay in the workplace, make himself available to facilitate the investigation of the refusal to work. So if an employee says, well, this particular equipment is defective, it's unsafe, the employee can't now leave the workplace and go home. The law says the employee must stay at the workplace in a safe environment or be reassigned work of an appropriate nature. So what the law says is really protecting both the employer and employee, and making it provisions to investigate that specific event, right? So if you say, is this piece of equipment, okay, fine, let's investigate the piece of equipment, stop work around this piece of equipment, investigate, and determine whether it's safe or unsafe. Now, even if the employee was mistaken, maybe it was, he didn't understand or so forth, the employee is still protected in that you cannot take punitive action against the employee, right? Unless, of course, you can prove that if it's a repeated sort of refusal to work, or there may be industrial relation issues, then that's a different story in which you deal with it. But the law is really meant to allow for cooperation and discussion between the employee and the management regarding safety, right? And to handle or manage refusal to work in a very responsible manner. Yeah, Derwin, I hope I answered your question there.
Yeah, that was good, because a lot of the times, and you hit the nail right in here as far as, hey, I know, you know what? Nah, I know, nah, it's unsafe. It's unsafe, and they got everybody, and then and again, it's a course as far as bringing all these stuff, investigations and dunging tools. There's a course to production and that kind of stuff. So there's a nice shedding a light as far as being the employee. You have to be specific in that regard. In the quarters that I work, even though you do orientations and you do safety orientations and that kind of stuff, and they empower the employee to say, well, probably just based off of, again, just a random slide that you might have, and you'll itemize certain hazards, and you say, well, it's unsafe, but to really say, well, what is unsafe about it? They may not be able to clarify and to say certain things, or put it into words. So that's a good aspect of it that is really important.
And to add, refusal to work is really where the person could suffer a critical injury or death. And there's a definition in the law, what is considered a critical injury. And of course, well, death is death, right? So,
right.
So it's not, so, if it's, it's very, very specific. That is, so you're looking to really and truly protect really what the manifestation of extremely unsafe conditions and unsafe acts, as the case might be.
Yeah. Appreciate it.
Yeah.
Right. We have Shelley Bell Parker. You could unmute and say what you have to say. Sorry. We're still not hearing you. I don't know for what reason we are not getting your audio. But her question was, how do you get managers more involved and enthused about safety? Sometimes I get more pushback from managers and not the staff. That's from Karim.
Yeah, Sherry, that is not unique in our industry. I think that is an experience that all safety professionals face, regardless of the industry. I can tell you that without fear of being contradicted, even for my colleagues who work in the oil industry and the energy sector, and these are big international companies, they do suffer from the same thing, because we have engineers, we have managers. The engineers sometimes they're only concerned with production, and they believe that all we need to do is produce and get the work done, and you get a lot of pushback. Part of it has to deal with leadership. I always found that setting the right tone at the top is important. I was fortunate that we had the opportunity to, well, we have NGC, National Gas Company. I invited their Vice President Operations to give our safety executives, our CEO and directors, a talk about safety, how they manage safety. And the tone starts from the top, in terms of, and also how they onboard their managers and engineers coming into the company, letting them understand that, yes, we are a high-performing organization. Yes, we want production. Yes, we have the political, the political sometimes direction and so forth. But at the end of the day, it's a marriage between production and safety, and we all have a responsibility. And so you have your safety managers getting involved in safety walks every 3 months. You take the CEO out, or the operations manager out on to take a safety walk, And so those are the things that get them involved. Sometimes may have a little safety competition, best facility, our reward system. So all those things are ways to get safety managers involved. Last year we had in Trinidad process plan safety, which is process plan engineers. They had a safety seminar talking about safety in different like the ammonia plants and so forth. And for the whole day, the presentations were not done by safety practitioners. I think only 2 presentations were done by safety practitioners. All of the presentations were done by senior people within the respective companies, whatever was the VP or the president of Nutrien or whatever it is. And they were able to talk so comfortably about safety, right? So they live it. Now that sets the tone. So now everything within the company now people follow because it's part of their performance. They measure safety as part of their performance in addition to production and the finance and so forth. So it's not an easy fix. It's human beings you're dealing with. And you have to continue to work with people and get them involved and so forth.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Right.
Oh.
Well, I think we have taken up. Do you have another question, please?
No, just a point to add. As you're talking about performance and the same sector and with the KPIs, and just first-hand experience with big major companies. Their COOs are being fired for, again, as you was talking about, process safety incidents. And so KPIs and adding KPIs as part of their performance and being linked to their tenure, if it could happen at any particular stage, in the onboarding process, that could also be a good tool to mitigate against managers not really taking safety on in a certain sense.
Yeah, sometimes a lot of companies they a safety incident. We look at BP. We all know some of the incidents, well profiled. Some people lost their jobs, share price drop. But for some of us, there was a company called Union Carbide, and Union Carbide was connected with the Bhopal incident in India in just around the early 1980s. A lot of people died because of the release of isocyanate. And up to this day, people are still being affected by the effects of the Bhopal incident. Union Carbide, they would have changed their name and the company was rebranded and so forth. Union Carbide actually is now what we call DuPont, right? DuPont company is already Union Carbide. And DuPont is actually one of the globally recognized leaders in process safety in the world. So this is a company coming out of a major catastrophe, a chemical incident. And they have been able to learn and put systems in place so much so that they are now a leader in process safety in the world. Right? So it is possible for companies to learn and to change and so forth. So it's a really interesting story if you trace back the history of DuPont and what they would have gone through as catastrophes like that and still be able now to be really recognized for what they are. Yeah. Yeah, Ignatius. Yeah.
Yes. Okay. Well, thank you very much, Roger, for this very comprehensive, albeit we're constrained by time because I know there's so much that you have to offer us. But I think we'll take it in strides and maybe at some future date we can meet again and that you can share some of your wealth of experience with us. During the proceedings, I think you mentioned about the various policies and regulations in Trinidad, which is similar to what obtains in most of the English-speaking Commonwealth Caribbean. So I think a lot of that augurs well, and we will certainly be keeping in touch with our utilities, and maybe at some other future period we can have such a presentation. Of course, colleagues, we thank you for joining with us this afternoon and thank the Operators Without Borders for finding us an excellent presenter in Mr. Roger Karim, who is the Senior Manager, Regulatory and Emergency Management at the Water and Sewage Authority in Trinidad. He is an HSE professional with over 20 years experience in both the public and private sectors. So thanks again, Roger. And thanks all of you for joining us, and also to the CWWA team. I see that you are here in large numbers this afternoon. Thank you for joining us, and let's keep this going. It's me, Ignatius Jean, signing out, Executive Director at CAWASA, our CAWASA Wednesday webinars, number 3. Have a good evening, everyone.
Okay, good evening.
Bye.
Good evening.
Take care. Bye-bye.
All right, thanks, guys. Take care.
Good evening. Thank you. Well done.
All right, thank you.
My pleasure. Thanks for being here. Thanks, sir.
Mr. Jean, you good?
Yeah, I'm all right. Good, thank you.
Take care.
All right.